Hello, hello, hello. Hope everyone is well. Had a little bit of time. Actually, I have to work from home today, so I'm pulling double duty here, and I was going to read a couple of short papers from the Dugin, from the Eurasianist Internet Archive. A couple of them here. I have quite a few that I have here that I've been working through, and I'm continuing my exploration into the philosopher and the work of Alexander Dugin, and kind of wanted to use this time to read a little bit and have any QA or have any kind of a free for all. I know there's a lot of questions, concerns, and regarding Dugin. So hoping that this is you guys can hear me well. If there's anybody in the chat yet, let me know that it's all copacetic, and we'll get started here in a minute. Let's see. Yesterday I read this longer piece entitled Human Society After the Crisis, Hell on Earth Through the Lens of Depth Psychology, where Dugin went in rather deeply into the work of Carl Jung, and talked about a lot of the concepts there and his interpretation of it, and in context to the end of the world, the eschaton, the revelation, the apocalypse, all that fun stuff that seems to be in the air these days. It's rather long. I do have some notes from it. Maybe we can, go through that. I have a couple other shorter ones that I wanted to read here. The one this was written or translated in 2019, entitled Notes on Thought. There's another one, Dugin's Guideline World Philosophy Day. Another rather long one, but maybe we can get into this one too, from Sacred Geography to Geopolitics, where really get into a lot of the symbolism with regards to sacred geography and geopolitics, which I think my subscribers and you guys would be interested in, especially if you come from the Peugeot end of the spectrum here. So I didn't know if people will log on here, so I'll give it just a minute. If anybody is in the chat yet, please feel free to say hello and let me know if you can hear me, and we will get started here. Oops, let me turn this off. So let's see here. Yeah, there we go. All right, so anybody in there, please say hello. Let me know my volume and my audio is good to go. And we'll get started here. And again, any questions are fair game. Feel free to ask away, and we'll see if we can get something fruitful going here. Let me wait to get people in here. I just had read through this from Sacred Geography to Geopolitics. I found it fascinating, actually. Some of the sections: geopolitics as an intermediary science. Goes into the land and sea symbolism, the symbolism of the landscape, East and West sacred geography. And I'm pulling double duty here because I am working from home today. So I want to make sure that I am able to do that as well. But I'm going to wait for people to get in here. I don't know if anyone is in here yet. I can't really tell. So if you guys are in here, and please let me know in the chat if you can hear me well, if there's audio. And we'll get started here shortly. Again, love to get a little QA going here. Any questions are fair game, and I'll answer to the best of my ability based on what I can kind of muster up on the moment here. So let me know when someone can hear me in the chat, and we'll get started here in just a moment. I don't know. It says there's 2, 3, 4 people in here, but I can't tell. Again, just someone give me a little thumbs up or a shout out if you can hear me, if the volume is good, and then we will get started. Let me see. I think my mic's on. Test. Hello. Is anybody out there? Can you hear me? I got a bunch of, so I've been going on the Eurasianist Internet Archive, where there's a bunch of Dugin's translated writings, and I don't like to read on the computer, so I've printed literally This is just some of them, tons of pages, and have gotten through and have been able to get through them pretty quickly because I'm a philosophy nerd, and this is kind of right up my alley. A lot of deep philosophy and whatnot in his writings, obviously, looking at his philosophical side. So anybody there, just let me know that you can hear me, that my audio is good. I wonder if it is not, since nobody has said anything yet. And then we have some options of what we can read here. Let's see here. I have this Alexander Dugin, From Sacred Geography to Geopolitics. I have a short one, which I will read on thought. It says, Alexander Dugin, Notes on Thought. And I have Dugin's Guideline, World Philosophy Day. These are each just a couple of pages, so we'll start there. And then if things get rolling, then I'll get into this symbolism, Dugin's symbolism with regards to sacred geography and geopolitics. So let me know if you can hear me. So someone in the chat, give me a thumbs up or a hello, and we'll get started here. We will start with World Philosophy Day. And again, any questions, just chime in with questions as we'll start kind of reading through this. This is a short 2-page. It was translated, I think even written in 2019. This was translated by Jaffe Arnold. Oh, okay. Thank you. Abrazard. Thank you very much for letting me know there. So again, any questions you have, feel free to chime in. So this is from 2019. Today, the third Thursday of November, on the initiative of UNESCO, is World Philosophical Day, or World Philosophy Day. This date is rather bureaucratic, and its celebration is just a formality. On the whole, World Philosophy Day is something artificial and even foolish, which is not worth the attention of a philosopher, not to mention a non-philosopher. But let this be on an occasion for reflection. What is philosophy? Oh, hold on one second. Yes, sweetheart. Hold on one second. Yes, baby. Okay. Okay, Mom. Huh? Hold on, sweetheart. All right, let people trickle in here. I think I have to get some juice for my daughter, so I'm sorry about this, guys, but I don't think anybody's in here yet. All right. So anybody got any questions? I know I just put this up here, so there's no warning. I don't know if people will log on here, and if not, we can cut this short. But who's out in the chat? Someone say hello. What are you interested in? Any thoughts on Dugin? Critiques, appreciations? What are you interested in terms of my channel? Because I have a lot of different topics and thought authors and whatnot. So I'd love to hear from you guys. And I'm sorry I don't do these a lot. I really don't have time. Fiona, or evening. Good. Thank you for chiming in here. Appreciate you. Trying to multitask here. I don't do these live streams a lot because I don't have kind of the time. And I think I'd like to try to do that more often and set a standard time, because I just popped on here without notice. And I got a lot that I've read and I want to share with you guys. There's just so much And again, I'm a philosophy nerd. That's what my kind of background is in, and I'm an Orthodox Christian. So having to finally get some of being able to read some of Dugin's actual writings, from in his perspective, from a philosophical perspective, being an Orthodox Christian is fascinating to me. And a lot of stuff that he says, I get a lot of comments of people being real skeptical, but I try to compartmentalize his orthodoxy and his philosophical thinking and his political thinking, and I try to appreciate it on its own. So let me know what you guys any topics you'd like to discuss before I get into the reading here, and we'll get going. All right. So I was reading this World Philosophy Day from Dugin. It was translated from 2019. I would say Dugin is a philosophical supremacist. Hello, Xavier. Thanks for popping on. He's definitely a philosophical supremacist, and it'll be clear with what he says here. These are maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs in total here. He says, on the whole, World Philosophy Day is something artificial and even foolish, which is not worth the attention of a philosopher, not to mention a non-philosopher. But let this be an occasion for reflection. What is philosophy? Xavier says, good to catch you live. Been watching your Dugin content. Very interesting. Thanks for chiming in. Yeah, I don't do these too often. I'd like to start doing them more. So any questions or any topics you want to dig into, feel free to shoot, and I'll answer and dialogue the best I can. So again, what is philosophy here? He says, there are 2 erroneous opinions which do not even allow us to approach what philosophy is from a distance. Those who believe that philosophy is only one among many possible human engagements or professions are hopeless. No less hopeless are those who believe that philosophy is a science, or even the most important of the sciences. Such an approach kills philosophy and does not allow one to think about its nature and essence. He says, man is thought. All other properties, such as body, mobility, emotions, and sensations, are possessed by other species. What makes human is thought. Hence Aristotle's definition, quote, man is a living being possessing logos. If you do not possess logos, then you are not a human. A separate discussion could be who you are. Would be who are you if you're incapable of thinking, he asks. Clearly not merely an animal. An animal corresponds to its own archetype without thinking. But if a person loses thought, they are sinning against their archetype and find themselves nowhere. They would even still have to try to be like a pig or a shark. I think this is an interesting point Dugin makes here, especially in light of his critique of modernity and postmodernity, how our human consciousness, our mind, has been colonized by these machinic forces, these machinic forces that are kind of turning humanity, and he says humanity moving towards this automaton, moving towards this machinic way of thinking and being, where technically we will not be human beings anymore. And he's saying that here thought is what differentiates the human being from other animals. He says philosophy is the realm of thinking that is so intense that thought turns towards itself and beings to think of thought. Thinking of itself, thought thereby thinks of everything surrounding it in an entirely different manner, in a philosophical manner. Philosophical thinking is the highest of thinking. The philosopher is a human in the full sense of the word. He who is not ultimately a philosopher, or is not a philosopher at all, is not entirely human. Why is man given thought? So that he might think and, in the end, think about thinking. Let's see here. Oh, got a question here. Can a Christian be a nationalist based on race or country? Isn't it only another distraction? I think it depends. I think the holding up of nationalism as the highest ideal, I think, is problematic. But I think if you can place your nationalism within the hierarchy appropriately, I think there's reality and coherence at every level of being. And if the hierarchy is appropriately oriented and situated, you can have something like nationalism being something that you cherish, along with, it goes down even to, you have your individual self, right? If you put yourself above all other concerns, then you're worshiping yourself, right? You become an idol. Your family, your community, your sports team, all of these monikers that kind of situate a body at one level or the other, I think are valid. So I think I forgot where I got this quote. It might have been Paul Vanderklay said, "Nationalism is the methadone of spirituality," or something like that. So long, answer short here. I think you can have pride, certain type of pride in your nation, as long as it's appropriately situated and appropriately motivated. But then the question comes: what is a nation? What is a nation in terms of the history of the geopolitical and kind of the history as such? Most nations, the thought of nation states or the concept of nation states is a rather new phenomenon. This is something Dugin critiques. That the modern nation is a simulacra. It's not necessarily rooted in any deep identity. And even I'm Greek, and even Greece in its modern instantiation is a few hundred years old, right? Obviously, that's not the case for Greece as a whole. So is there a difference between the modern conception of nations and what Dugin would call civilizations, that have a deep rooted identity and a culture and an ethos and a philosophy and a logos and a way of being? So it'd be interesting to, explore what is the nation, and is this a category that can sustain going forward? I'd love to hear what you guys think. More on philosophy here. He says, philosophy is the realm of thinking. That it is so intense that thought turns towards itself, and beings think of thought. Thinking of itself, thought thereby thinks of everything surrounding it in an entirely different manner, in a philosophical manner. All right, Sparrow, how are you? It says, dear James, what do you think about Alexander's belief that, quote, the whole meaning of Russia is to bring about the last thought of God, which is the destruction of the whole world? Yeah, I think that is a sensational. I think that Dugin is sincere in saying that, but I think it is sensational. And I think Dugin, he has a background in kind of hermetics, and a background in kind of neuro-linguistic programming and magic, and understands how you can use words to, have an impact, right? And I think he uses that, from his past. He uses this idea and he says stuff, he works with chaos theory. He talks about chaos a lot. And from first reading, it just seems like he's not, looking to destroy, and it's sensationalist, and it's no different than kind of a jihadist type, way of thinking. But I think there's more there. So it's important to, dive in, dig in deeper, and don't stop at a term like that. Because I'm with you. I have reservations when I hear something like, the thought of God, which is the destruction of the whole world. Of course, that, you're kind of taken aback when you hear something like that. But instead of reacting and judging what that means, right, and immediately reacting, dig in a little bit, see the context where it came from. What does he mean? And you don't have to agree with it, right? The big thing for me is exploring kind of the Russian thing, right? The Russian nous, the Russian logos, which, we have philosophy, German philosophy, from all over the world, right? But we don't have any kind of real modern philosophical and ontological and metaphysical understanding of the world from the Russian mind, from the Russian soul, in a sense. So that's what I'm interested in. And reading Dugin early on, I was taken aback, and I would actually get drained reading him, because a lot of the inflammatory geopolitical stuff is tough to come across. But I would suggest going deeper into his actual philosophical work, and there's a lot of fruit, there's a lot of gold to be mined there, and I don't agree with a lot of what I see, and it's not about agreeing with it. Because he's looking at the West from the Russian, ethic, from the Russian consciousness, right? So it's not the same as us looking at the West from our Western, point of view. So it's interesting. There's places where I think he is, he's not seeing it as we see it, obviously, but I think there's a resonance that can happen in exploring his thought, no matter how incendiary it seems on first pass. And especially because he is a very well-versed, from what I've seen, Orthodox Christian in terms of the church fathers. So it's interesting. And when I do, I'm gonna talk with him eventually here, and I want to get into his orthodoxy and how he kind of squares this material, this geopolitical stance that he has, really focusing on this world, this fallen world, and and how to bring up a multipolarity and civilizational multipolarity, how he squares that with the idea of like Christ from the Gospel of Matthew, right? He seems to be more in line a lot of times with Christ from the book of Revelation, where, there's a juxtaposition there. And the question is, what do we do with politics with regards to the kingdom? I don't know. These are open questions, I think. So Sparrow, I hope I, gave some sort of answer there. But yeah, feel free to ask away. Again, we're digging into Dugin's thoughts on thought and philosophy here, right? He says, philosophical thinking is the highest of thinking. Therefore, a philosopher is not simply busy with a profession, but penetrates the center of humanness. The philosopher is a human in the full sense of the word. He who is not ultimately a philosopher, or is not a philosopher at all, is not entirely human, he says. Why is man given thought? So that he may think, and in the end, think about thinking. This is the aim of the human being as a species. If a person does not approach philosophy, they abandon their nature and aim, which means that they are on the way to being subhuman. This is what philosophy is. It is that to which all born humans are called. A human is not something given, but a task. And this task consists of the necessity of becoming human, i.e. a philosopher. Let's see. Rob says, would it be fair to say that some part of the Russian mind viewpoint stems from the generational emotional trauma? I don't know. I think considering something like generational emotional trauma, that is a Western 21st century paradigm of thinking, right? And which is, obviously we're immersed in it, and a lot of the Russian philosophers and thinkers and novelists and in literature, it's very dark, Dostoevsky and you name it. I think it is born out of a certain time and place, right? In modern Russia in the 20th century was, under the yoke of the Soviet Union, right? But out of that, will spring, out of suffering, out of these trials and tribulations, will spring something I think worthwhile to look at and consider, and that will situate our souls or our perspectives, better oriented to encounter something like the Russian ethic, the Russian mind, the Russian soul. So I don't know if that makes sense. I would say yes, actually. So is there generational emotional trauma? Yes, but I would say that's a Western conceptualization, and from a Western kind of psychoanalytic perspective, because I don't know how, the Russian mind would look at something like trauma. Maybe it's something that is, more akin to, the Orthodox ethos, which sees suffering a lot differently than the Western psychoanalytic tradition sees suffering. But I think it's a good question and an open question for me. Asparo, you're welcome. Thank you. All right, back a little bit here. Again, I think, Dugin is a philosophical supremacist, if nothing. He says, okay, just repeating a little bit. He says, this is what philosophy is. It is that to which all human beings are born. A human is not something given, but a task. And this task consists of the necessity of becoming human, i.e. a philosopher. He says, now for the second misconception, which is characteristic of the professional philosophical community. There's nothing more vulgar and repulsive than this professional philosophical community. I have to agree with him here. It is virtually impossible to meet a real philosopher among them. In this milieu, philosophy is regarded as a science, which means almost the same thing as profession. Yet philosophy is not a science, but that which makes science possible, which lies at its heart and which endows science with being and reality. Science is the servant of philosophy, he says. As long as the structures of thinking and the standards of knowledge are not set by a philosopher, science simply does not exist. What do you guys think of these words here? Science comes into play when a philosopher finishes his work. Scientists are migrant workers, serving creators and architects. They may be amazing craftsmen, or they might be bunglers, but they will always be and exclusively implementers. Philosophy lies at the root of science, Dugin says. And when science breaks away from philosophy, it becomes more and more absurd. Science without philosophy is akin to a paranoid disorder, when man fiercely and stubbornly does something, the meaning of which has long since been lost, to the point that all that remains is the irrefutable sense of terror that pushes him towards ever newer sequences of hysterical reasonings. Philosophy calls this deontologization, the loss of the correlation between thinking and being, the oblivion of being. When science ceases to be philosophy, then philosophy becomes science, and as logically follows, both are finished. All right, Sparrow says there's a field of scholastics called physiohistory or psychohistory, which explores child abuse in history in all nations, its effects on leadership, wars, and history. Yeah, that's interesting. Let me know what book or what authors that that's an interesting reference there. Rob says the structure or idea of generational emotional trauma may have Western labels, but at a core, humanity experiences trauma and suffering. I agree, Rob. I agree, but the context and the orientation of that trauma and that suffering, I think, is what is interesting to explore, right? Because in our Western psychoanalytic tradition, trauma and suffering are repressed and they manifest in neuroses, which, when you go to a shrink, you try to uncover repressive thoughts or traumatic experiences, either to release them or to release the neurotic tendencies that are manifest from it. So I'm with you. Xavier says it sounds very much like the need to gather more and more garments of skin to compensate for the fall. Okay, I hear you there. I hear you there. Pano, what's up, my brother? How are you, man? To put this analogy in programming terms, scientists are like the software engineers or IT workers that leverage various software tools built by the software engineers. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'd like to push that analogy further. Right? Who are the programmers, and what is our philosophers? Is that what they are? Programmers? Are they there to program using language, human language as their operating system? Be interesting to explore. Jared, what's happening? He says, when he says destruction of the whole world, I wonder what he means of the world. Makes me think of Hebrews. Our God is a consuming fire. Every shakeable thing is shaken away. That's a good question. And he says in one of his writings of the term world, it's got so many different meanings in so many different words, even like in German, it's Welt, and Russian, it's Mir. And I think in this context, a world is an existential horizon of meaning that situates a community. So when we think about the destruction of the world, I'm not thinking it as the terms in as the explosion of the planet Earth, more like the end of a civilizational paradigm, something like that. Keith Taylor, this channel is awesome. Christ is risen, brother. Indeed, he is risen. Thank you. I appreciate those kind words, Keith. Thank you. Xavier says the disconnection between philosophy and science being the fault event in the case. Yes. I think that science in its place, right, as we were talking earlier about, can you be nationalistic? I think you can also, science is a wonderful, beautiful method of questioning the world that gives you specific, repeatable, probabilistic answers that are very useful. But, I think once we worship that, or we put that as an end in itself, I think that's where we fall into this, this materialist trap that a lot of us are observing here. Let's see, Pano says software itself is built by computer scientists who are the philosophers building out the metaphysical space. Yeah. So the software programmers, right, are like, scientific metaphysics builder, something like that. I hear you. I like that, Pano. I'd like to explore that a little bit more. He says here, let me see if I can find it. I actually have it right here in his notes on thought. He actually uses something similar. He says, see if I can find the specific part. I think it might be at the beginning here. He says, he's talking about, this is notes on thought. He says, everyone thinks they can think, and that what they are usually doing is called thinking. He says, this is a misconception. He says, those who have a certain culture of thought and are capable of self-reflection enter, I hope consciously and responsibly, into what are virtually mechanical processes of circulating certain schools, trajectories, and systems. They dwell there following the main semantic rules and canons. In the best case, they can change, add to, correct, or amend something in the system, but certainly nothing fundamental. This is how dissertations teach, quote unquote, to think. That is, of course, when they are honestly, thoroughly, and independently conceived and written. But this does not yet mean thinking. This is a preparatory stage, sometimes an important one, but it is far from the ultimate goal. Moreover, this does not necessarily lead to thought. In a number of cases, such might even become a block on the birth of thought. Moreover, one can think without such. This is the first case is associated exclusively with those who have in one way or another consciously devoted their lives to science and culture and to everything connected to such. These are the quote unquote programmers of thinking and sometimes the hackers. You with me, Pano? Says so in the first case are these programmers or the hackers, the programmers of thinking. Then he says the second case includes everyone else. They have no conscious moment of entering into an organized and structured intellectual environment. They remain in ignorance with respect to where they are from and what it is that revolves inside their head and how such is organized. These are the ordinary users of thinking who use ready-made programs without wondering about their algorithms. Here, quote-unquote thought is understood to be the fragments of random inferences and instances of scattered and unsystematized knowledge and formulas whose origins remain unknown to this thinker. The free recycling of rational calculations made me think of the Greek term logizmo, right? Logizmo. All of which is continuously attacked by the sheaf of invasions of the unconscious, which lend to thinking a sinister, corporally saturated character. The latter aspect has been the subject of psychoanalysis, for which the very process of thinking is a projection of the game of irrational corporeal forces barely covered with pseudo-rational nonsense. Subjectivity here is a random combination of the complexes which were firmly established in the early infancy and remain fundamentally unchanged. That is, everything that a person, quote-unquote, thinks about over the course of their life is simply a detailed, lifelong history of pain and anamnesis. The second case, that of banal consciousness, is not thought at all, but the waste of the bodily machinery. The first is an act of belonging to a higher but also completely alienated system in which there is no subjectivity in sight. We can see a hint of this in the recognition of humanists that their discourses and all their discourses they here are instances of quoting. Postmodernism takes this reflection to the point of absurdity and turns it into a new mental illness that converges with the idiocy of banal consciousness. One could, of course, propose mixed variables as well, such as those of the quote-unquote semi-intellectual or semi-layman, the consumer, but such yields nothing new. Only an advanced idiot or a mentally retarded intellectual. The alienation is not changed. We are outside of thought. We do not think, but rather participate in an alienated mechanical process, some clearer, others dimmer, others dimmer, sorry. It's a little bit longer here. It says, where is thought? Dugin says, on a different plane. Thought is born and comes into being in a completely different dimension compared to what we are doing when it seems to us that we are, quote unquote, thinking. It is something radically other. The experience of thought means the collapse of everything we usually take such to mean. Thought can begin only when we make thought out to be finished. Both everyday delirium and intellectual scholarly citations are barriers to the birth of thought. They should be abolished. Thought is born out of the moment of madness or nonsense, when the rotation of the gears of both everyday and scientific consciousness is suddenly stopped. In the face of death, this feels good, he says. And here he puts thinking in the context of death. I think this is interesting to discuss here. Let's see, where is I get? He says, but not for everyone. Pseudo-thinking reliably protects us from death by barricading against the very possibility of experiencing it with countless instances, fears, calculations, plans, and hopes. For doctors, miracles, police, common sense, science, and the, quote, light at the end of the tunnel. Everything is subject to death, but death is the lot of the chosen. Death is intimately connected to thought. Thought is born only in the face of death. That which is born freely and horribly in the face of death, when everything else we have held thought to be has been destroyed, that is the real thought. Only at this moment does subjectivity make itself known, having been all other cases dissolved amidst the alienated fields of unfocused consciousness. Thought requires colossal, superhuman effort to overcome the fundamental threshold. He goes on there. So that was a little bit long, but let's see. Hanno says, in the real world, we participate in the cosmos built and sustained by God. Yep. What do you mean by real world? And what is that in context of our world? Let's see. Click accept. Science seems to justify itself outwardly, but by utility, I don't think that's really what drives discovery as an endeavor. I agree. Let's see here. Pano, imagine if Heidegger saw our days. I think he would be vindicated if he did. Subontic obsession in a simulacrum of technology. Yeah, that's right on. I think Dugin talks a lot about this, that we are living in a simulation. He reads Baudrillard and he talks about the society of the spectacle, and this is a manifestation of a rootless kind of rootless ontology in metaphysics. Xavier says this aligns perfectly with his idea that the nous is the subject of the fourth political theory. Yeah, the nous is definitely his concept of the nous, especially in his big 28-volume Noomachia, is an exploration of the nous, right? Noomachia means war of the mind, right? So nous means mind, but it's not what's in your head or just what's in your head. It's the broader, kind of intellectual, space that we exist in. And the nous, like from an Orthodox, I think he was bringing in an Orthodox perspective. The nous is the broader container that holds Noomachia, is where the logi interact, with each other to form civilizations and cultures, things of that nature. Since the nous inhabits the plane where all of these thought algorithms run as automations, yes. I think there are levels of the nous, right? So we can think of the nous as the mind or the intellect, but then there's also the Greek, the patristic term nous, which is more kind of spiritually oriented, the spiritual eye, the heart mind, something like that. I think there are multiple dimensions to the nous, and it'd be interesting to talk more about. Let's see here. Jared Isaac Fairfield, what are you reading from about thought? That is a short article entitled Notes on Thought, and it's from, I forgot what series it's from, but it's connected with this World Philosophical Day. So kind of saying what thinking is here. Real just meaning outside computers. So are computers not real? I mean, we're on computers right now. We're interacting with each other, and I'm asking, I don't know, right? Is this a real ontological engagement between persons mediated by computational electronic processes? I don't know. I'd say yes. See, Xavier, in a way, software programming is turning these algorithms that run on the thought plane into algorithms that run on a physical plane. That's a great point. And one of my favorite novel concepts that I've come across from Dugin is this idea of transpositionality of mythos and logos, right? So in terms of transcription or transpositionality, you can think of how the DNA transcribes, transcribes amino acids into proteins, right? So it's this spiritualization of matter and this materialization of the spirit, right? So he says that the logos is like the outward manifested organized logic of reality, and the mythos is the spiritual substructure that presupposes and holds and supports the logos. But there's an interplay and a transpositionality between the logos and mythos. I also thought of it, there's a transpositionality between the conscious and the subconscious mind, where there can be, the spiritual, a lot to say there. So see here. Reddit tier IRL. Yeah. Make something that was dead, automated thoughts, into something even more dead, automated matter. Yeah, I'm with you. It's the antenna. Xavier says, thanks. I need to learn more about the nous. I didn't know there are levels. Yes, this is real, but heavily mitigated. Yes. Greetings from Texas. Hello, John. Thanks for jumping on. Again, I'm reading a bit here and just doing an impromptu Q&A. Everything is, ask me anything type thing. I don't get a lot of time to do these here. So hello, Elon. Welcome, man. Thank you. Let me finish this couple more paragraphs on thought, right? Remember, he says, where is thought? It's on a different plane. Later on, he says, thought is incredibly difficult. It is a feat. And he's echoing Heidegger. Heidegger wrote a book entitled Das ist Thinking. What is thinking? He says, thought is incredibly difficult. It is a feat. At the same time, it is a transformative illumination. Thought is a transformative illumination. It is not merely some particular sublime thought, but just thought as such. One could even say any thought. Take into consideration the root for love in Russian lubov, and the word any. So thought is not the creation of systems or doctrines, which are consequences and not necessary ones at that. The main aspect of thought is not its result and its manifestations, but thought itself, its being. Thought irreversibly changes anyone who has at least once approached it. Thought gives us the first view of who it is that is thinking, the subject. But it is not us. It is the radical other in us, someone hidden inside. To think means to present the possibility of emerging out of the inner darkness into the inner light. Because I'm doing double duty here and working from home. So we've had a COVID exposure at the office. Everybody had to kind of work from home here. So forgive me for popping in and out there. The reading today. So I have a handful of, so if you go to the Eurasian Archive, a lot of Dugin's work that has been translated is there. I don't like reading on the computer, so I've printed a bunch out. Something that I just tore through yesterday was this, and it's entitled Human Society After the Crisis, Hell on Earth Through the Lens of Depth Psychology, looking deeply into the work of Carl Jung. So maybe we can get into that a little here. Hold on one second. All right. Pano says the Greek word for discursive thought is dianoia. Dianoia. The root is nous there as well. Yeah. Interesting. Let's see, there's something else I wanted to read here. See, Percival says you should make an interview with Dugin. You should be quite familiar with his work by now to make it quite productive. Yeah, that is the goal, actually. I will be kind of having a meeting with him. I know a friend of mine, John David Ebert, he has a channel. I've interviewed him a few times. He's going to be interviewing him here shortly. I was going to give him a couple questions to ask. But right now, the main question that I have in my head is how he squares his orthodox ethos with his geopolitical, fallen world interests, and how those square, and then how he squares the gospel and Christ from Matthew, right, and Christ from Revelation, and what is the relationship between the political and the eschaton? What is the relationship between the second coming and the political and the question of politics? But that's just starting to kind of think through that here. I've contacted Dugin on Instagram. He will respond to an interview. Yeah, I will reach out to him when it's time. I think that all of this will be censored or banned very shortly here. I don't even know if they're going to start going after people that are discussing with or talking to Dugin. It seems that that's the way things are kind of going. All these musings about disinformation and malinformation that we see was just used. I saw an American politician talking about, the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about the world. It's about fighting disinformation and misinformation. Right. So if you don't think that's going to be leveraged against us, like it already is in the West, that's coming. So. All right. The war of all versus all. Yeah, unfortunately. See, Xavier says the geopolitical and civilizatory criticism that Dugin does remind me intensely of Zizek. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm very familiar with Zizek. I would like to interview him as well. I do see some similarities. I don't think they've spoken together yet, at least publicly. But I do see some resonances there. Might be some cognitive dissonance when it comes to some of those political actionable leanings there with Dugin. I would maybe agree there. They seem to be a sort of dark mirror of each other. Yeah, that's a good point. I like, Dugin is well familiar and even appreciates postmodernism, right? Even though he critiques it appropriately, I think. Same thing with Zizek. I think Zizek is not a woke. He's kind of post-woke left. So I'm interested in him as well. I have another book here. I just came across this guy, and he had an interview with Vivek Shiber, the class matrix, right? Of course, a lefty, but he criticizes the cultural turn that happened in the 60s and 70s, where the Marxist critique of class relations was geared culturally. And I think this is where the CRT and a lot of the craziness that we're seeing happening now is this reorientation from class structure to racial and cultural issues, which I think has been a big mistake from the perspective of the left. And this is a good book to check out that critique. Zizek was post-woke before the woke. That perfectly said. Well said. Let's see here. The channel Philosophy Tube, which I assume is a State Department propaganda, has a new video explicitly attacking Dugin and Heidegger's thoughts. So it's definitely in the crosshairs. Yes, Philosophy Tube. I think I'm familiar with that channel. I'm not sure if I've seen that one. Yeah, definitely. I'm probably going to do a broader video talking through this, the form from sacred geography to geopolitics, where he really brings in symbolism, right? And he's got a pretty sophisticated understanding of symbolic patterns, but that which he uses to apply to geopolitical. And later on in his Neomachia, he talks about the geosophical underpinnings of reality, right? He talks about philosophical continents. And again, it goes with this transpositional concept as well. So he goes into this, maybe we'll get into it a little bit here, from sacred geography to geopolitics. He says, geopolitics is an intermediary science. Geopolitical concepts have long been the most important factor in modern politics. These concepts are based on general principles which allow one to readily analyze the situation of any country and any individual region. Let's see here. Elon says, off topic, but I saw Michael Miller recently picked up a book on Russian cosmism. Hopefully he may converge, covering that ideology soon. Are you familiar with that at all? I am not. I have a talk with Michael Millerman. Hasn't been scheduled yet, but we've been going back and forth to have a conversation, which I'm looking forward to. So he says, in the form in which, maybe I'll just, because I did read this, I'll give a breakdown here. Right? He says, in the form in which it exists today, geopolitics is undoubtedly a worldly, profane, secularized science. However, among all other modern sciences, it is geopolitics which has preserved the greatest connection to tradition and traditional sciences. René Guénon says that modern chemistry is the product. Modern chemistry is the product of the desacralization of the traditional science of alchemy, just as modern physics has its origin in magic. Exactly in the same way, one can say that the modern geopolitics is a product of the secularization and desacralization of another traditional science, that of sacred geography. And then he brings in the symbolism of the land and sea. So two essential concepts of geopolitics are land and sea. And these two elements, land and water, that lie at the root of humans' qualitative imagination of earthly space. And experiencing land and sea, earth and water, man enters into contact with the fundamental aspects of his existence. Land is stability, gravity, fixity, space as such. Water is mobility, softness, dynamism, and time. I think that vibes well with Mathieu Peugeot's work and the symbolic world. A lot more resonance is there. It says the universality of the experiences of earth and water yields the traditional concept of the firmament, since the presence of the higher waters, the source of rain, in the sky also implies the presence of symmetric and necessary element, earth, land, and celestial vault. He says, altogether, earth, sea, and ocean are in essence the major categories of earthly existence. Later on, he says, thus the geopolitics of the U.S. is of an island nature despite the dimensions of North America. There's more there. And then he gets into the symbolism of landscape and the symbolism of cardinal direction. So he talks about the symbolism of land and water, and he talks about the symbolism of the north, south, east, and west, right? East is more towards the spiritual, right? The west is more towards the profane. The north is more towards the integral. Let me see if I can find it here. he has these two concepts, the thalassocratic, which is like the water-based empires, and the telluritic, which is more land-based. So he says, besides these two global categories of land and sea, geopolitics also operates with more particular definitions. Maritime and oceanic formations can be differentiated among thalassocratic realities. He says, tellurocracy also has its own particular forms. One can distinguish between the civilization of the steppe and the civilization of the forest, the civilization of the mountains and the civilization of the plains, the civilization of the desert and the civilization of the ice. So he goes into these in a little bit of detail. The symbolism of the steppe, the forest, the mountains, the plains, the desert, and the ice. In sacred geography, diverse varieties of landscapes are understood as a symbolic complex linked to particularities of the state, religious, and ethical ideologies of different people. Even in the case where we are dealing with a universalist ecumenical religion, the concrete embodiment of such is a given people, race, or state will be subject to adaptation to the local sacred geographical concept. It says deserts and steppes represent the geopolitical microcosm of the nomads. So deserts and steppes, we have the nomads, and it is precisely in the deserts and the steppes that the tellurocratic tendency reaches its climax, as the quote-unquote water factor is minimally present. Then he brings in the empire of Genghis Khan and the Arab Caliphate for these examples here. And then the symbolism of the mountain. He says mountains and mountain civilizations are more often than not archaic and fragmentary. I found this fascinating here and coherent. Mountain countries are generally not sources of expansion. In fact, they tend to gather the victims of other tellurocratic forces, geopolitical expansion. No empire has its center in the mountains region. Hence, often repeated maxim of sacred geography, quote, mountains are inhabited by demons. On the other hand, he says, the idea that mountains can conserve the residual traces of ancient races and civilizations is reflected by the fact that it is precisely in mountains that the sacred centers of tradition are placed. One could even say that mountains correspond to some kind of spiritual power in teleocracy. A logical combination of both concepts. Now he brings in the hill. So mountain, now he's talking about a hill. He says a hill is a dwelling place. The hill is a symbol of imperial might rising above the secular level of the steppe, but it does not reach the limit of the supreme power, as is the case with the mountains. A hill is a dwelling place for a king, a count, an emperor, but not a priest. Then he brings in the forest, right? The forest in sacred geography is similar to the mountains in a definite sense. The symbolism of the tree corresponds to the symbolism of the mountain. Both the former and the latter designate the world axis. Therefore, in tellurocracies, remember land-based empires, the forest plays a peripheral function, as it too is the place of the priests, the druids, the magi, and the hermits, but also at the same time the place of demons, i.e. archaic residuals from a vanished past. Thus, a forest cannot serve as the center of an overland empire. And he brings in the tundra here, right? The tundra represents the northern analog to the steppe and the desert, although the cold climate makes it much less significant from a geopolitical point of view. The peripherality reaches its apogee with the icebergs, which, similar to mountains, are deeply archaic zones. It is telling that the Eskimo shamanic tradition calls for a future shaman to depart alone on the ice, from where the world beyond will be open to him. Thus, ice is a heretic zone, the threshold of another world. It's funny when you think of Antarctica and the whole flat Earth theory, right? He says that ice is the threshold of another world. And then he goes into the cardinal direction. He says, in the context of sacred geography, cardinal direction possesses a special qualitative nature. He says, sacred geography on the basis of cosmic symbolism traditionally considers the East to be the land of the spirit, the paradisal land, the land of perfection, abundance. He says the East is the mansion of the gods. He says, from the point of view of natural symbolism, the East is the place where the sun, the light of the world, the material symbol of divinity, and the spirit ascends. Hence the Russian word for East, which is Vostok. The West, he says, and I'm just, glancing over here, he says, the West is the place where the sun descends, where it sinks down. In accordance with the logic of natural cosmic symbolism, the ancient traditions organized their sacred space, founded their cult centers, burial places, temples, and edifices, and interpreted the natural and civilizational features of the planet's geographical culture and political territories. Thus, the very structure of migrations, wars, campaigns, demographic waves, empire building, etc., was defined by the primordial pragmatic logic of sacred geography. And he goes on and on there. Let's see if there's any. Back to the chat here. Let's see here. This is a great take on what is the deeper appeal of the heartland theory of geopolitics. Yes, it's definitely, that's right. First of all, don't you think that the idea of sacredness of land is the root of Ukraine-Russia conflict? It doesn't seem that Putin particularly interested in people of Ukraine, so land is more important to him. I think that would follow. That would follow from this kind of heartland, from the concept and the idea of the heartland. I think there's a multiplicity of concerns and priorities that is manifesting in Ukraine. I think it's where kind of the multipolarity versus unipolarity is hot right now. And I think you saw in the United States just approved without any, without any debate or anything, $40 billion to go to Ukraine, right, for weapons and security. 40 billion is almost, if not as much as Russia spends on its entire military per year, right? In the United States, we have food shortages, gas prices. We have, and I don't want to just repeat kind of Tucker Carlson type talking points, but it seems the leaders in those that are supposed to represent their constituency in the United States absolutely have abdicated their duty. Question is what to do about that. To send $40 billion in weapons to Ukraine, which is just causing suffering to the Ukrainian people. They don't want, they've articulated, they don't want a peace deal. Boris Johnson went and met with Zelensky and said, we don't want a peace deal. We want to weaken Russia. Right. So, man, it's just crazy what's going on there. Let's see. Click accept says desacralization of alchemy is clear when you look at how they invert new drugs like the recent mass distribution ones. It is an industrial scale, semi-computational trial and error process. Yes. That's why the aliens hide there. Yeah, they're in, Hitler had this, there's a connection between him and the Nordic, Icelands, where there was a UFO. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that conspiracy or whatever it is. Let's see, referring to Antarctica, the continent. Yep, I got you. See, I shrieked when I heard Tucker's name uttered. Why? Tell me why. In a good way or a bad way? Let me just check in here real quick. All right. Any other questions or topics you guys want to get into here? A lot more to read here. Actually recently picked up Dugin's book, Philosophy of Another Beginning. It's rather thick. So I don't know when I'm going to get into this here. But if you're familiar with Heidegger or interested, I really recommend his later, more poetic book on Eragnus, the philosophy of the event, called Contributions to Philosophy of the Event. Really, really wonderful stuff. I think I have a video talking through and reading through some of that. Sorry, guys. Hold on. Have you heard any of the Orthodox nationalist Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson's work? I have. His work on Venice and republicanism and maritime origin of what we call today globalism. I have not specifically heard his writings, but it seems to be lined up with Dugin, at least in that context. Right. See, Hiking with Jonesy says, so are we supposed to support a man who jailed his opponents and has shut down any media television stations who oppose him? I don't think so. I don't know that you have a choice, though, right? I don't know that you can even have a critique, at least in public, which is telling, I say. Elon says he shrieked like when the Beatles played in Shea Stadium. Hiking with Jonesy, you're talking about Biden. I think he's talking about Zelensky in a bad way here. Sparrow says, seemed to work in Alexander, and the context was clear. He meant little death for, says all should seek it, for only after death can anyone find love. Interesting. See if there's anything else I want to bring up here before we see if I can get into the young writings, post anthropology here. I'll go a little bit longer. How long have we been going? An hour. I don't know why I have that on, actually. It's just actually making me hot. I'm not listening to anything. So in his post-anthropology work, is Human Society and the Crisis, Hell on Earth through the lens of depth psychology. So he brings in, so the logos is conscious, and mythos is unconscious, just going through some of my notes here. He says that Jung works developed Freud's theory and established a new topology of human psychology. Freud had already shown that in addition to the I, the ego, an invisible and repressed it, German S, and id, actively operates within man. Jung demonstrated that the foundation of this it is rooted in a special reality common to all people. This is the collective unconscious, of course. This is kind of the working into depth psychology. This is the study of the interconnectedness between the two main levels of this topology, between logos and myth, buried the concept of rationality and the notion of, quote, progress at the very first stage. According to G. Durand, it turns out that the latter are, quote, are nothing other than the rationalization of the myth of Prometheus. And he brings in this term heteroteile, Heteroteile, a sociological law that states that social processes almost always attain goals other than those they set to begin with, thus overturning the cause and effect logic in which the founding fathers of sociology so firmly believed. And he brings in this concept of the social logos, right? He says that in analyzing opinion, sociologists derive from such a half manifested and half hidden truth and thus explain the mechanism and in turn semantic structure of lies, silence, euphemism, projections, transportations, and other rhetorical tropes. It is thus the sum of extracted scientific truths, clarifications, and etiologies of misconceptions and lies, the content of the social logos that constitutes the object of classical sociology. Later on here, I have this starred. Some, such as Castells, have timidly suggested that the logos does not die, but moves on to a new form of existence as a network. But this did not and does not sound very convincing. In any case, starting from the end of the 20th century, classical society stood at the threshold of, as the optimists say, a fundamental qualitative metamorphosis, or as the pessimists such as Spengler suspected, collapse. The social moment through the eyes of depth sociologists slipping into the night. It says the modern era of the Enlightenment reflected the rise of the myth of Prometheus, who inspired both the rationalists and the romantics, the people of day and the poets of night. It goes on and on. But with the end of the 19th century, Prometheus began to give way to the myth of Dionysus. I think that there is a falling out, I'm not exactly sure, between, what's his name? The guy who wrote Prometheus and Atlas, Giorgiani, Jason Reza Giorgiani. I think they both are with the publishing house Arctos, and I think they are falling out. And I think because obviously Giorgiani, or not obviously, is really, putting forth this Promethean solution to the problems of modernity and the kind of end of the world. And I think Dugin strictly critiques Prometheism and says it's a kind of part of the root problem. Brings in more of a Dionysian solution, but not a Dionysian in the drunken, artistic sense. He says he's more interested in a Dionysus that is, separate from that. So a different logic, a different type of logos of Dionysus. But anyways, let's get a few more questions. See, only after a literal apocalypse, fighting the evil Antichrist of the West, and after his death, destruction of will, anyone find immortality. Biden has sent billions to support Ukraine borders, but our borders are a huge mess. Democrats, fascism for sure. Would you agree that American open border policy is based on the idea that land is not sacred, but the land be sacred without having borders in Dugin's ideology? Yeah, I would say so. Let us, as Jesus said, love our enemies and pray for those who abuse us. Yes, resist the devil, but do it with love. I think he was, and that's something I'm interested in, right? To love your neighbor and love your enemies. I think that's absolutely right. But it doesn't mean that, that means like on an individual basis, right? But if you have kind of demonic forces collectively that are attacking you, I think there is a notion where I don't know. I think there's a distinction to be made there between love your neighbor, love those around you on a personal level, but on a collective level, I think it's something that requires some more thought. Prometheism really sounds like Luciferianism by another name. That's exactly what it is, actually. Luciferianism, the light bringer. What did Prometheus do? He stole the fire from the gods, right? So I think there's a direct correlation there. Jared Isaac says, very interested in this Dionysian logos. Could you talk about that a bit more? Yeah, he talks about that in the work No Magia, right? So there are three fundamental logi that in his exploration and his research that he found manifest themselves in every single civilization, culture, ethos, everything that he's explored. He said he hasn't found one yet. So he started exploring civilizations under these two logi, right? The logos of Apollo and the logos of Dionysus, right? So you can think of the logos of Apollo being like the god, right? Or heaven. Logos of Dionysus, and there's also a third logos that manifested itself, and that's the logos of Sybil, the black logos, right? And in between the black logos and the logos of light, you have this dark logos, which is Dionysus. Dionysus is a mediator, mediates in different civilizations the subjectivity, what the person is in a particular civilization is Dionysian, right? It incorporates both the light and the dark, and there are tendencies towards the light and towards the dark depending on the particular civilization. So it's really an archetype of kind of the Christ figure, right? But he's saying this in this specific metaphysical system he's using to apply philosophically noomachia. He uses Dionysus, right? Let's see. Yeah, there's a lot there too. He says that, as Plato and the Neoplatonists reflect the Apollonian logos, right? And Lucretides, the Heraclitus, not Heraclitus, but Democritus, and even the kind of hedonist, right? In terms of Greek philosophy, Plato represents Apollo. The atomists represent Sybil, right? The black logos. What philosopher would you say represents in this Greek philosophical sense? What philosopher in this context represents Dionysus, right? So Apollonian, you have Plato. Sibyllian, you have the atomists, the materialists, right? Who is in the middle? Who's the mediator? Who's the Dionysian philosopher in terms of ancient Greek philosophy? It's good to protect your children, women, and nations with force, but to hate and to fight with tears and one's enemy is different. Yep, I agree, Sparrow, for sure. I'm interested in Dugin's belief in the metaphysics and how philosophy knowledge was basically destroyed by Kant and his buddies and the Great Enlightenment, which led to the current insanity. Something that's very novel and interesting one that I read from Dugin, and he says that modernity is not something new. It's something very old. He says modernity and the Enlightenment, right, and this valorizing of rationality as such, empiricism, that was brought in by the British empiricists and then Kant and the German philosophers. This is not new, right? It's something that is pre-Indo-European, right? It is what was defeated by the Apollonian logos of Christianity, right? Christianity is configured by an by Apollonian logos, right? So you can think of Apollo as God, Dionysus so you can think of Apollo as the father, Dionysus as the son, and Sybil as the mother. And he's saying that modernity is a result of a double castration. So you have the castration, the death of God is the first manifestation of the emergence of the dark logos of Sybil, of the great mother, right? The death of God, and then the double castration of the son. And this made me think of it in terms of castration in the psychoanalytic sense, right? And there's a lot there that we could discuss. And he goes into the myth of the double castration. I forgot the name of I forgot the exact name of it, but he seems like we're living in the world of the emergence of the great mother, which is focused on matter, which is dark, focused on chaos, non-hierarchy, multiplicity, the philosophy of the rhizome from Deleuze and whatnot. And he's saying that modernity, so he situates all of these systems and these temporal systems in eternity, right? Eternity. So modernity is placed in its place in eternity, and it's not something new. It's something that is pagan, that is pre-Indo-European, and he calls it Titanic, right? He has this concept of Titanomachy, right, which is the war of the gods. And he's saying that the god Apollo, right, has won, and what the history of Western metaphysics has been the consecutive degradation of the Apollonian logos. And in modernity, since modernity was started kind of with the British empiricists, we've had the resurrection of the Titans. The Titans have been resurrected, and we're experiencing the battle, the spiritual warfare between the gods, right? That's what noomachia means, right? The war of the mind, right? And we're seeing emerging the old Titans that are coming up right now. So I mean, it has a lot of resonances with Revelation, right? In terms of the end times, where you'll have Archangel Michael and the angels fighting the devil and his demons, right? That's Titanomachy, right? And he brings this analytic to many different cultural perspectives, which I find fascinating here. All right, you guys got anything else you wanted to talk about here before we sign off? Any other questions? Any other interest? Anything else you'd like me to see on the channel here? Elon says, wow, what is that about the Titanomachy? See if I can find anything else here. Maybe I'll read a little bit from the end of this post-anthropology. This is just, I'll get to the end of it, which is just, hope it makes sense without. What book would you recommend by Dugin? Fourth Political Theory. I would start there. So he's talking about in this the animus, the shadow, in terms of the Jungian terms here, the coming of the shadow. He says the shadow will be one of the main actors of the Jungian apocalypse. Fantasies of living shadows in Anderson's work in popular folklore are a famous tale repeatedly surfacing in literature, theater, and opera. Shadow is the synonym for the devil, and we can say that this image coincides with the wide and varying descriptions of the Antichrist or the coming of Satan. Jung's perspective differs from religious theological views on this subject in that he examines the figure of the devil in the spirit of origin. Apokatastasis are relatively negative. He says later on, the shadow is failed self. After all, the devil was once an angel of light who fell. What will the shadow be in its coming? This is difficult to imagine since the social landscape will change significantly. The collapse of the logos, he's saying that we're seeing the collapse of the Apollonian logos, will not cancel science, or more precisely technology. Hence, the dissolution of the individual might very well be combined with the continuation of technological progress by inertia. Therefore, the shadow will come in the entourage of machines and devices, but it will not be a singular human being or groups of beings. It will be something resembling a cloud, fog, a thinking nebula. Maybe think of egregore, right? A thinking nebula which can assume various identities, names, and types. These images will be somewhat vague, as if covered in a fog. The shadow will hardly appear in the form of monsters, but rather in the form of memories and languid and dense dreams. Later on, he says, from where does the male ego come from? Different sociologists, philosophers, and psychologists have offered different answers. The Marxist sociologist, for example, believes that gender is purely social phenomena. The ego is endowed with a male quality, exclusively society, the dictatorship of the superego, and the practice through education and the structuring of family relations. I'm just blowing through this here. The anima is the product of the pure male ego. The animus is the product of the purely female. The man who constitutes the woman's dream, the male from the S, has never existed and does not exist. This is not the male ego, but something quite different altogether. Prince Charming, the noble knight, the hero. The woman gives birth to and populates culture with him. Women created man. In the literal sense, she gave birth to him. Figuratively, she invented him. Man was thought up by women in three forms, as the baby, the hero, and the wise old teacher. He goes on and on there. Later on, he says, patriarchy was a product of the extrapolation of the female fantasy. Patriarchy was the product of the extrapolation of the female fantasy. And then it brings in at the end of this is long. I just took pieces from it. The radical subject as a possible, solution in this sense. Book you read. Xavier says, just out of curiosity, James, what is your academic background, or are you completely self-taught? I would say I do have a degree in political science and philosophy, but I'm self-taught because I've done way more thinking and reading and philosophizing after I got my degree, which was in 2006. So I found philosophy in college actually, and I used it I was very interested in it, but I didn't really get into it deeply until after. See, Percival says, so rational thought brought to extreme leads to totalitarianism and destruction of the civilization. Yes, I'd say that rational thought in its extreme and its veneration would lead eventually to the collapse, right? You think of the Tower of Babel, right? I think there's obviously a lot of resonances with the Tower of Babel, the hubris of being able to build a ziggurat towards the heavens, right? See what we're doing with artificial intelligence now, strictly through rationality and technology, with the hubris to build an artificial intelligence, which will end up making everyone and everything into paper clips. I don't know if you've heard that before. And so the answer is to redefine rational, but not only in materialistic sense, but also in a symbolic sense. I would say, yeah, I think the answer is to put rationality in appropriately in the hierarchy, right? And to appropriately reflect the nous, right? For the nous is not just the rationality, the intellect and the emotions. There's also a whole spiritual category or spiritual dimension that is missing from rationality, that because of the materialist epoch that we're in, right? So rationality, it's kind of like the tyranny of the rational. Hiking with Jonesy says, Canaanite idolatry and CERN, the shadow of evolution. Xavier says, I got to go now, but it was great to catch up live. Keep up the good work. Your channel is shaping up quite nicely. Thank you. Appreciate that. I appreciate that, guys. I'm trying to stay under the radar with my channel. I don't, I'd like it to kind of be where it's at. I'm not trying to specifically grow it. I mean, I appreciate the subscribers and people interested in it, but I don't want to like shoot up and I'd like to kind of stay under the radar the best I can. Hiking with Jonesy, self-educated man is a truly educated man. Yeah, I agree. So yeah, thank you guys. I'm gonna log off, and I'll do this again. Hopefully I'll be able to give some more heads up next time. So I'm gonna finish some stuff up here. So thank you everybody for the questions and for tuning in and for the support. I really appreciate it. And until next time, God bless, and I will see you later.